This is Lecture 1 in the U.S. History to 1877 course. This lecture is called Indigenous America. And I'd like to talk just a brief moment before the full lecture about these two images. The first one on the left is very, very interesting. It's a modern visualization of Cahokia in the Mississippi River Valley, the largest Native American urban center in what's now the United States. And it's a depiction of what it might have appeared like around 1150 CE. Within the 2,200-acre tract there, which is located a few miles west of Collinsville, Illinois, lie the archaeological remnants of the central section of the ancient settlement that we now know as Cahokia, and I strongly recommend that you go see it if you're ever in central Illinois. Cahokia was the largest and most influential urban settlement of the Mississippian culture, right? The Mississippian culture developed advanced societies across much of what is now the central and southeastern United States. This was, of course, 1,000 years before European contact. Today, these mounds are considered to be the largest and most complex archaeological sites north of the great pre-Columbian cities that you know in Mexico from photographs and from archaeological documentaries and things like that. And on the right is a depiction of something that the Spanish used to do during their invasion of the Americas. During that period, they often relied on indigenous allies to conquer the land that they wanted to conquer. In this 16th century drawing, again, the one on the right, depicts the Spanish and one of their indigenous allies fighting against another group of indigenous Americans. And now we're going to go on to the main part of the lecture, which for this week is narrated by Dana Flowers. Next week, we talk about colliding cultures.
Here's what we're going to cover in this lecture. The first Americans, Indian freedom, European freedom, the expansion of Europe, contact, the Spanish Empire, the French and Dutch empires. The first Americans to settle what eventually became the United States were culturally diverse, speaking hundreds of languages and living in various types of societies. They migrated by land over the Bering Strait or by sea anywhere from 15,000 to 60,000 years ago, some reaching the southern tip of South America perhaps 11,000 years ago. Facing a warming climate and hunting animals such as the woolly mammoth and giant bison into extinction, these first settlers later developed agriculture, including the cultivation of maize, corn, squash, and beans. Emerging around 9,000 years ago, at approximately the same time as agriculture developed in the Near East, the practice allowed settled civilizations to be established. This map illustrates the probable routes by which the first Americans settled the Western Hemisphere at various times between 15,000 and 60,000 years ago. The diverse Indian societies of the Americas first encountered by the Europeans included civilizations with populations of several million people, large cities, road and irrigation systems, trade networks, and impressive architectural achievements. But even the most developed Indian civilizations, located in South America, lacked the technologies such as metal tools and machines, gunpowder, and the scientific knowledge needed for long-distance navigation, which contributed to the European ability to carry out and justify conquest. Nonetheless, American Indians had perfected farming and hunting techniques, established political power structures and religious beliefs, and engaged in long-distance trade. In North America, about 3,500 years ago, one native culture, the Mound Builders, centered their community in the lower Mississippi River Valley around a series of semicircular mounds and established extensive trade networks throughout the continent. For over 3,000 years, in what is now northeastern Arizona, the Hopi and Zuni and their ancestors lived in settled villages with irrigation, dam, and canal systems and engaged in long-distance trade, becoming, after a period of decline, what the Spanish called the Pueblo Indians. The Pacific coast was also densely populated by hundreds of independent groups of natives, who lived primarily by fishing and gathering food. And on the Great Plains, many Indians hunted the buffalo herds, while others lived in agricultural villages. In eastern North America, hundreds of tribes, from the Choctaw, Cherokee, and Chickasaw in the southeast to the Iroquois people of the northeast, who formed the Great League of Peace, lived by hunting, fishing, gathering, and agriculture, and engaged each other in trade, diplomacy, and occasionally war. When Europeans arrived, Native peoples were tremendously diverse and differentiated by language, custom, political system, and religious belief. They didn't consider themselves a single, unified people with a common cultural or racial identity, nor did they possess a sense of America as a continent or hemisphere. This world map, produced in 1507 by the German mapmaker Martin Waldseemüller, was the first to depict the full Western Hemisphere and the first to include the name America on the lower part of South America for part of the New World. It also seemed to indicate the Pacific Ocean, but no European encountered that ocean until the Spanish explorer Balboa in 1513. This is a modern aerial photograph of the ruins of Pueblo Bonita in Chaco Canyon in present-day New Mexico. The rectangular structures are the foundations of dwellings, and the circular ones are kivas, or places of religious worship. These are cliff dwellings in Canyon de Chelly, in the area of modern-day Arizona, built sometime between 300 and 1300 and photographed in 1873. The native population of North America at the time of first contact with Europeans consisted of numerous tribes with their own languages, religious beliefs, and economic and social structures. This map suggests the numerous ways of life existing at the time. The village of Sacoton, a drawing by John White. A central street links houses surrounded by fields of corn. In the lower part, dancing Indians take part in a religious ceremony. Indians fishing in a 1585 drawing by John White. The canoe is filled with fish, while two men harpoon others in the background. Among the wildlife illustrated are hammerhead sharks and catfish. Despite their diversity, North American Indian societies did have some common characteristics. Their religions and religious practices were often directly related to farming and hunting. Plants, animals, and non-living things, such as water and wind, were invested with spiritual power. Distinct ideas of defined membership also developed within and across communities. Each Indian society respected and gave authority to shamans, medicine men, and other religious leaders who seemed to have spiritual or supernatural powers. While most of their religions, like those of Europe, held that a single creator was at the top of the spiritual order, they did not distinguish sharply between the natural and the supernatural or the secular and the religious. Unlike the Europeans, North American Indian societies did not treat land as a commodity to be owned privately by individuals, but instead had family and communal-based notions of property. Although tribes and groups had systems of social status, Indians did not devote themselves to accumulating wealth and material goods. And Indian trading was as much a social and cultural practice, emphasizing generosity and gift-giving as an economic exchange. Relations between men and women were also markedly different from those of Europeans. Most, but not all, North American Indian societies were matrilineal, and in some groups it was possible for women to own property, engage in premarital sex, divorce their husbands, take part in religious ceremonies, and help select male tribal leaders. Men assumed political leadership and proved their masculinity by engaging in hunting, agriculture, or warfare. A Catawba map illustrates the differences between Indian and European conceptions of landed property. The map depicts not possession of a specific territory, but trade and diplomatic connections between various native groups and with the colony of Virginia, represented by the rectangle on the lower right. The map, inscribed on deerskin, was originally presented by Indian chiefs to Governor Francis Nicholson of South Carolina in 1721. This copy, the only version that survives, was made by the governor for the authorities in London. it added English labels that conveyed what the Indians had related orally with the gift. This is a detail from a 17th century map of English North America and shows Native Americans hunting whales off of Long Island. Europeans first tended to see Indians as either noble savages or uncivilized and brutal inferior barbarians. Over time, negative images of the Indians came to dominate Europeans' view of indigenous peoples. With a focus on natives' apparent lack of religion, land use practices, and gender relations as the basis for their relative inferiority, Indians were seen as devilish heathens, as people who didn't use the land properly, which, in the eyes of the English, French, and Dutch, justified their expropriation of the land, and as people who subverted European gender roles by allowing weak men to engage in leisure activities like hunting and fishing, leaving agricultural work to native women, who, Europeans believed, belonged in the home. Europeans connected women's agricultural labor to a lack of freedom, and men's hunting to laziness and weakness. This slide shows a 17th century engraving by a French Jesuit priest and illustrates many Europeans' view of Indian religion. A demon hovers over an Iroquois longhouse, suggesting that Indians worship the devil. Some Europeans saw Native Americans as embodying freedom and liberty, as Europeans understood the terms. But most soon thought that such notions of freedom were foreign to Native societies. Europeans believed that Indians were savages in part because they did not seem to have governments or legal systems and lacked the respect for authority, discipline, and order that Europeans believed marked their civilizations. The modern idea of freedom as personal independence, often based on the ownership of private property, meant little in most Indian societies. But Indians had their own ideas of freedom, as is evident in the practice of small-scale slavery in some Indian groups, although buying and selling slaves was unknown, and in their resistance to enslavement by Europeans. Although Indians respected individual thought and judgment that conflicted with group decisions, they generally emphasized commitment to family and community, group autonomy, self-determination, and mutual obligations accompanied by belonging and connectedness over individual freedom. This is an image of Indian women planting crops while men break the sod. An engraving by Théodore de Brie, based on a painting by Jacques Lemoyne de Morgue. Morgue was part of an expedition of French Huguenots to Florida in 1564. He escaped when the Spanish destroyed the outpost in the following year. When Europeans colonized the New World, they had multiple ideas of freedom as a collection of rights and privileges, many of which were reserved for a small portion of the population. One important idea of freedom was religious or moral, based on an individual's decision to subordinate himself to the Christian God. This was not the same as modern notions of religious freedom or tolerance. Each European country had an established church, and their governments often suppressed or heavily regulated other Christian and non-Christian groups. Secular ideas of freedom located liberty in individual obedience to law and the acceptance of one's rank and its duties within a rigid and extensive social hierarchy, ranging from urban poor and rural peasants at the bottom to church officials, hereditary aristocrats and nobles, and kings and other members of monarchies at the top. Inequality was built into all social relations. The king ruled by divine right, and superiors demanded deference from their social inferiors. In families, men had authority over the dependent women and children, whose legal identities were subsumed by that of the male. Women could not own property, control their wages, write separate wills, or even, in most cases, divorce. And husbands had rights to their wives' labor and bodies. Few men enjoyed the freedom derived from economic independence, which usually involved land ownership, and property qualifications for voting meant that few men could vote. Modern civil liberties, such as freedom of religion and speech, did not exist. Workers who defied employers and labor contracts suffered harsh criminal penalties. Yet each European country that colonized the New World claimed to be spreading freedom for itself and the Indians. The title page of The Great Voyage to the Country of the Hurons, published in Paris in 1632 by Gabriel Sagard, one of the first missionaries to New France, includes images of Native Americans and Catholic friars. Father Segard also produced a dictionary of the Huron language. Europeans discovered the Americas only because they were interested in finding a sea route to India, China, and the islands of the East Indies, which had long been the basis of a lucrative land-based trade in silk, tea, spices, porcelain, and other luxury goods. In the early 15th century, a large Chinese naval expedition intended to show China's power went all the way to East Africa and could have gone farther west to the Americas. But the Chinese were uninterested in establishing a maritime empire. The Portuguese, benefiting from new sailing and navigation techniques, first explored the Atlantic by making their way down the western coast of Africa. Sailing in recently developed ships called caravels that were capable of long-distance travel, they encountered powerful African kingdoms as they made their way south. Along the way, they also began establishing small colonies on islands in the Atlantic off the African coast, the first sugar plantations based on slavery in the Atlantic world. Furthermore, sailors hoped to find the African source of the gold trade that had provided Europe with most of its supply of the precious metal. By 1498, the Portuguese had explored the Indian coast, and they soon established a maritime empire with trading outposts throughout Africa, India, southern China, and Indonesia. Until 1434, Europeans had never seen the coast of sub-Saharan Africa, including the forest kingdoms south of Mali that were the source of the gold trade. A Portuguese ship that returned with a sprig of rosemary from West Africa proved that the trip could be made. By 1485, the Portuguese reached Benin and began establishing fortified trading posts called factories, in reference to the merchants there, who were called factors. That trade activity inspired other European nations to follow soon thereafter. In addition to outposts on the continent, the Portuguese colonized many of the islands off the coast, where they established sugar plantations worked by native and African slaves. In the 15th century, the world known to Europeans was limited to Europe, parts of Africa, and Asia. Explorers from Portugal sought to find a sea route to the east in order to circumvent the Italian city-states and Middle Eastern rulers who controlled the overland trade. Sankour University in Timbuktu, in present-day Mali, was one of the great Islamic centers of learning in 14th century Africa. Although slavery existed in Africa before the Europeans came, Africans enslaved other Africans who were criminals, debtors, or captives in war. They worked in households and families, had some rights, and could become free. African slavery was only one of several forms of labor, and was not the basis of African economies. With the Portuguese and other Europeans in Africa by the end of the 15th century, slavery became purely economic, and a large accelerated slave trade developed within and beyond Africa. During the last half of the 15th century, at least 100,000 slaves were transported to Spain and Portugal, and in 1502, the first slaves were taken to the Caribbean. After reaching West Africa, Portuguese explorers pushed farther south. Bartolomeu Dias reached the Cape of Good Hope in 1487, and Vasco da Gama rounded it to reach India in 1498. The route replaced the Italian city-states as the primary hub of trade with the East, only shortly after Columbus discovered what he believed to be a new westerly route to India. Columbus was a seasoned Mediterranean and North Atlantic sailor from Genoa who, despite popular belief, knew the Earth was round, yet he underestimated its size. Europeans were unaware of the massive American continents between Europe and Asia. Brief Viking travels to North America had been forgotten in all but Norse legend shortly after their outposts were abandoned. Columbus was motivated by religious and economic motives. He hoped to convert Asian peoples to Christianity and renew European efforts to retake Jerusalem from Muslim control. Though he had trouble gaining financial support for his travels, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of the newly united Spain decided to back his venture after completion of the Reconquista, in which the Moors were driven from Spain. He sailed with royal letters granting permission to make trade agreements with Asian rulers and endorsements from bankers and merchants, all of whom desired to circumvent Muslim trade monopolies with the East. a detail from the Cantino world map depicting the western coast of Africa at the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. Created by an anonymous Portuguese mapmaker in 1502, the map included Europe, Africa, and a small part of the Western Hemisphere, described as the islands lately discovered in the parts of India. It was smuggled out of Portugal by Alberto Cantino, a diplomat representing an Italian city-state. After only 33 days at sea, on October 12, 1492, Columbus arrived at the Bahamas. The exact landing site continues to be disputed, but was most likely San Salvador. He soon went on to Hispaniola, now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and Cuba. He brought 10 natives, whom he called Indians, back to Spain for conversion to Christianity. The next year saw Columbus return with more ships and men, and marked the beginnings of Spanish colonization of the New World. Another Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, explored the coast of South America between 1499 and 1502, clearly demonstrating the discovery of a new continent, which would come to bear his name. Vespucci realized that the inhabitants were not residents of the East Indies, but the name Indians has endured to the present day. A host of explorers and fishermen from other European nations, including England, France, and Portugal, soon came to the Americas. Jean Cabot, a Genoese merchant who settled in England, reached Newfoundland in 1497, and Pedro Cabral claimed Brazil for Portugal in 1500. But Spanish conquistadors such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro took the lead in conquering the Americas, including large native civilizations in South America, for national glory, wealth, and Catholicism, devastating these cultures through warfare and primarily disease exposure, thus laying the basis for the gold and silver mines that would enrich the Spanish crown. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa became the first to cross Panama and see the Pacific Ocean. Ferdinand Magellan led the first expedition around the globe, encountering islands in the Pacific previously unknown to Europeans. The transatlantic flow of goods and people mixed millions of years of separate evolution, throwing together plants, animals, and cultures. This Columbian exchange transformed both Europe and the Americas, but the impact of war, enslavement, and especially diseases introduced by the Europeans was a demographic disaster for the native peoples of the New World, whose population fell dramatically. In the 150 years since European contact, as many as 80 million Indians, nearly 1/5 of humankind at that time, died. Columbus's landfall, an engraving from La Lettera del Sol, Letter from the Islands. This 1493 pamphlet reproduced, in the form of a poem, Columbus's first letter describing his voyage of the previous year. Under the watchful eye of King Ferdinand of Spain, Columbus and his men land on a Caribbean island while local Indians flee. This slide shows Christopher Columbus's first Atlantic crossing in 1492, and was soon followed by voyages of discovery by English, Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian explorers. Engravings from the Florentine Codex of the forces of Cortés marching on Tenochtitlan and assaulting the city with cannon fire. The differences in military technology between the Spanish and Aztecs is evident. Indians who allied with Cortés had helped him build vessels and carry them in pieces over mountains to the city. The Codex, a volume formed by stitching together manuscript pages, was prepared under the supervision of a Spanish missionary in 16th century Mexico. This table shows the estimated regional populations of the Americas around 1500. A drawing from around 1700 shows an Indian suffering from smallpox. The Columbian exchange, the flow of goods and people across the Atlantic, included animals, plants, technology, and diseases. By the mid-1500s, the Spanish had established an enormous global colonial empire, from Europe to the Americas and Asia. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were now highways moving people and goods, including gold and silver shipped from Mexico and Peru to Spain and on to the Philippines and China. The Spanish Empire encompassed the most populous and mineral-rich areas of the New World and included large cities such as Mexico City. The Spanish system of colonial government was an elaborate hierarchy of appointed lawyers and bureaucrats under the authority of the Spanish monarchy, with a significant role for the Catholic Church, especially in administering Indians. Elected assemblies were absent. Royal officials were often appointees from Spain rather than criollos, or creoles, persons born in the colonies of European ancestry. The imperial state was a real and continuous presence in Spanish America, but as its power declined, local elites gained more authority. The Spanish did not import African slaves in large numbers because they relied on the dwindling, but still substantial, Indian population to do hard agricultural and mining labor in mines and on haciendas. The Spanish government barred non-Christians and non-Spaniards from emigrating to the colonies, but many from Spain made the voyage, drawn by opportunities for social advancement. The initial emigrants were men, laborers, craftsmen, soldiers, officials, priests, professionals, and minor aristocrats. However, whole families would eventually emigrate as well. Peninsulares, or persons of European birth, were atop the social hierarchy, though they were only a tiny portion of the population. Indians always outnumbered European colonists in New Spain, and large areas remained effectively under their control. Spanish authorities emphasized the assimilation of these inhabitants into colonial society. The crown ordered that married men bring their wives to the colonies and that single men must marry. However, with a low population of unmarried Spanish women, colonial and indigenous populations intermarried. The Spanish government formally endorsed the practice, viewing it as a form of Christianizing the Indian population. By 1600, mestizos made up a large part of the population, and Spanish America evolved into a hybrid culture, but with a single official faith, language, and government. An example of the hybrid nature of the culture was Juan Diego's 1531 report of seeing a vision of the Virgin Mary as a dark-skinned Indian near a Mexican village. Miracles were reported. A shrine was built in Mary's honor, and the Virgin of Guadalupe would come to be a symbol of the mixing of Indian and Spanish cultures, and later of the modern nation of Mexico. This table shows the estimated regional populations of the world around 1500. This shows Young Woman with a Harpsichord, a colorful painting from Mexico in the early 1700s, and depicts an upper-class woman. Her dress, jewelry, fan, the cross around her neck, and the musical instrument all emphasize that while she lives in the colonies, she embodies the latest in European fashion and culture. An image from the Tlaxcala Codex, which chronicles events in a region of central Mexico in the 16th century. Aztec warriors dressed in eagle and jaguar costumes danced before Spanish officials and priests. Most Europeans believed in the inherent superiority of their cultures and societies over those of the Indians, and they rarely questioned their right to conquer them. Rather, they expected these societies to abandon their own cultures in favor of European culture. Before colonizing the New World, Europeans had fought each other in religious wars and conflicts, establishing a precedent for conquering other peoples and cultures based on religious and cultural notions of superiority and inferiority. In the case of Spain, the colonizers felt justified in conquest by Pope Alexander VI's decision to grant much of the Western Hemisphere to Spain. The papal decree came with a potent message that the colonizers were responsible for spreading the Catholic faith in their dominions. The Spanish, in particular, embraced the mission to convert the natives to Christianity. With the Protestant Reformation dividing the Catholic Church beginning in 1517, the Spanish believed they had to convert the natives to Catholicism to save them from heathenism and Protestantism. At this early stage of colonization, the Spanish had no concept of race as an innate, unchanging characteristic, and thus they hoped conversion would assist in their quest to assimilate the Indians and raise them to European levels of civilization. The drastic fall in Indian population due to epidemics and brutal forced labor systems hindered these efforts, but the conquistadors saw no contradiction between missionizing and using forced labor for personal and national profit. The Spanish colonizers saw Indians as a workforce for extracting gold and silver to enrich Spain, and in the process they worked many of the Indians to death. The Spanish believed they were giving the Indians freedom through Christian conversion, while they also exploited them to make Spaniards and the Spanish crown immensely rich. Pope Paul III outlawed American Indian enslavement, though not African enslavement, and Bartolomé de las Casas preached against the injustices committed against American Indians. But Las Casas, like Pope Paul III, had no qualms about African slavery, which he viewed instead as a way to avoid the brutalities being committed on the Indian population. An illustration from the Huehuetenco Codex, 1531, depicts Mexicans providing products and services as taxes to the Spanish conquerors. The banner of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus reflects the early spread of Christianity. The people of Huehuetenco, a town near Mexico City, had aided Hernán Cortés in his conquest of the Aztec Empire. The Codex was part of a successful lawsuit endorsed by Cortés in which the Indians challenged excessive taxation by colonial officials. 4 racial groups, taken from a series of paintings by the 18th century Mexican artist André de Islas, illustrates the racial mixing that took place in the Spanish Empire and some of the new vocabulary invented to describe it. First, the offspring of a Spaniard and Indian is a mestizo. Second, a Spaniard and a mestiza produce a castizo. Third, the child of an Indian and a mestiza is a coyote. And fourth, the child of an Indian man and African woman is a chino. This shows a benign view of Spanish colonization. This engraving from a 1621 book depicts Spanish missionaries bringing Christianity to New World natives, while priests do construction work. A fortified colonial town is visible in the background. In 1542, Spain's new laws, stemming from Pope Paul III's command and Las Casas' efforts, officially outlawed Indian slavery. Las Casas criticized his fellow Spaniards for their shocking atrocities and cruelties against native peoples, opposed their enslavement, and insisted that Indians were rational beings, not savages, who could not be denied their freedom and lands, even while he suggested that the importation of African slaves might protect the Indians from exploitation. Las Casas' criticisms helped spread the Black Legend of Spain as an exceptionally brutal and exploitative colonial power throughout Europe. Las Casas and other Spaniards believed that colonists' cruel treatment of the natives undermined their empire's mission to convert and assimilate them. But some Spanish colonists resisted imperial reforms, such as the outlawing of Indian slavery, by rebelling against the crown. In 1550, the Spanish abolished the encomienda system, in which Spanish colonists had the right to rule over conquered Indian lands and force Indians to work, and replaced it with the reparmiento system, in which Indians were legally free and entitled to wages, but were still required to perform a fixed amount of labor annually. Although they were no longer slaves, Indians were still exploited by landlords and priests. The Spaniards' treatment of American Indians improved marginally as they came to include education, medical care, and European goods into their modes of colonization, in addition to violence and disease. Nonetheless, the Black Legend had taken hold, and it provided potent justifications for other European nations to challenge Spain's dominance. Spanish conquistadors murdering Indians at Cusco in Peru. The Dutch-born engraver Theodore de Brie and his sons illustrated 10 volumes about New World exploration, published between 1590 and 1618. A Protestant, de Brie created vivid images that helped to spread the Black Legend of Spain as a uniquely cruel colonizer. Spanish explorers seeking a new kingdom of gold first came in the early 16th century to the areas that would become the United States, exploring the Pacific and Gulf coasts and parts of the American Southeast and Southwest. Additionally, the first colony was not in Jamestown or St. Augustine, but in Puerto Rico. Expeditions led by numerous Spanish explorers spread disease and devastation among Indian communities in North America. Hernando de Soto's journey through the Gulf Coast in the Southwest was especially brutal. Raping, torturing, and enslaving native peoples they encountered, De Soto's men also spread fatal diseases, all of which led to the virtual disappearance of once vibrant native communities. The first area to be colonized by the Spanish in what became today's United States was Florida. where the Spanish wiped out the French settlers in the hope of preventing further French colonization and ending piracy in nearby waters. Despite considerable Spanish efforts to build towns and forts and convert the Indians, the Spanish presence in Florida remained small. A view of San Carlos Borromeo de Carmelo, or Mission Carmel, in 1786 depicts Native Americans lined up to welcome a French scientific expedition. Sketched by a French explorer, this is the earliest known image of California. By around 1600, New Spain had become a vast empire stretching from the modern-day American Southwest through Mexico and Central America, and into the former Inca Kingdom in South America. This map shows early Spanish exploration, especially in the present-day United States. In the Southwest in 1598, the first major Spanish expedition in the area, led by Juan de Oñate, searched for fabled minerals. But when attacked by natives of Acoma in present-day New Mexico, the Spaniards retaliated by killing and enslaving the native inhabitants. Women and children were consigned to forced servitude, while men were subjected to the cutting off of one foot. Oñate was recalled by the Spanish authorities because of his brutal methods and failure to find gold, and a period of more stable colonial rule was initiated with the establishment of New Mexico and its capital, Santa Fe. By 1680, a small number of mostly mestizo Spanish colonists ruled over the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico. Tensions arose over the colonists' exploitation of the Indians' labor and their increasingly harsh efforts to convert them and eliminate indigenous religious practices and beliefs. Among other factors, this led to a successful revolt that year, which drove the Spanish from New Mexico and restored native autonomy. Led by Pope, a religious leader who had earlier been arrested by the Spanish for sorcery, the Pueblos attacked and nearly wiped out the entire population of Spanish colonists, in the process destroying all the symbols and icons of Spanish culture and Catholicism they could find. A dozen years later, cooperation between Pueblo peoples disintegrated, and the Spanish reconquered New Mexico for good. The Pueblo Revolt was the most complete victory for Native Americans over Europeans, and the only wholesale expulsion of settlers in the history of North America. Though it was victorious in the end, the incident caused Spain to rethink its practices and institute more tolerance for traditional religion, as well as a decreased demand on Indian labor in the 18th century. Acoma, the Sky City, as it appeared in 1904. St. Anthony and the Infant Jesus, painted on a tanned buffalo hide by a Franciscan priest in New Mexico in the early 18th century. This was not long after the Spanish reconquered the area, from which they had been driven by the Pueblo Revolt. Painted in 1718 by an unknown indigenous artist in modern-day Peru, the marriage of Captain Martín de Loyola to Beatriz Nusta depicts the wedding, in 1572, of a daughter of the last ruler of the Inca Empire and a nephew of Ignatius de Loyola, founder of the Jesuit order. With Inca royalty seated at the top left and Catholic saints in the center foreground, the work aims to legitimize Spain's colonial rule by assimilating into it the pre-conquest history of the Americas. Even as other European powers disdained Spain's treatment of the Indians, they aspired to match the Spanish Empire's incredible mineral wealth. With the balance of economic power altered by Spain's success, rival French, Dutch, and English colonists established colonies in North America during the 17th century. The French, who were first, hoped to find gold and locate a northwest passage to the Pacific. Failed initial settlements were followed by permanent settlements in the Mississippi River Valley and along the St. Lawrence River in what became Canada, and what was then called New France. But fears that France's large population, its main advantage against England, would be depleted by colonial settlement kept emigration low. Furthermore, negative reports of the conditions and opportunities in North America dissuaded many people from making the journey. Few in number and embracing the fur trade rather than agriculture, however, French colonists depended on friendly relations with local Indians. The French prided themselves on being more humane than rival empires. They were not interested in land, as were the English colonists, or in exploiting Indian labor, as had the Spanish. The French created elaborate military, commercial, and diplomatic connections with Native Americans, creating alliances in North America that were unparalleled in their durability. Samuel de Champlain emphasized tolerance and denied that the Indians were inferior to the Europeans. And though the French Jesuits sought to convert the Indians, the French generally were more tolerant of Indian religions and spiritual practices than the rival European colonists. In the middle ground of the upper Great Lakes region, French and Indians mixed in relative equality. Though Indians were encouraged to adopt European customs, it was more common for settlers to adopt the free life of the Indians. On the other hand, however, French colonialism brought disease and warfare to the native populations, especially as the fur trade and the introduction of European commodities intensified conflicts between native groups, and as wars between European colonists on the continent embroiled natives allied to different European powers. This engraving, which appears in Samuel de Champlain's 1613 account of his voyages, is the only likeness of the explorer from his own time. Champlain, wearing European armor and brandishing an arquebus, an advanced weapon of the period, stands at the center of this pitched battle between his Indian allies and the hostile Iroquois. An engraving of the Huron town Hochelaga, site of modern-day Montreal, from a book about voyages of discovery by Giovanni Battista Ramusio, an Italian geographer published in 1556. The Dutch first came to the New World in 1609 with Henry Hudson's exploration of New York Harbor and the river that would come to bear his name, setting the stage for the establishment in 1624 of New Amsterdam, the Dutch outpost on Manhattan that became the basis for New York. Although small in size and population, the Netherlands was the center of a global maritime empire of trade, culture, and enlightenment, and the Dutch invented practices such as the joint stock company that were critical to the birth of modern capitalism. The Dutch prided themselves on their devotion to liberty. In Europe, no other country aside from the Netherlands has established freedom of the press or the right to private religious practice. The Dutch Reformed Church was the official national church, but individuals were free to choose their religious preference. That freedom led people from all over Europe to seek religious and economic refuge among the Dutch, and many of those people would eventually settle in the Dutch colonies. Though the Netherlands was exceptional in its commitment to freedom of the press and religious toleration, New Netherland was hardly governed democratically. New Amsterdam was ruled by the West India Company and lacked an elected assembly or a town council, both of which were common in the Netherlands at the time. But Dutch slaves here had some rights. They were given land to support their families, but had to pay an annual fee to the company and work for the company when called on. Slaves in New Netherland worked on family farms or in craft labor rather than in a plantation system such as that in the West Indies. Women also experienced more freedom than in other colonies. Dutch law allowed them to retain separate legal identities from their husband, borrow money, and own property, and widows and daughters could expect to be included in wills alongside sons. New Netherland attracted a diverse array of settlers from different areas of the world, and of course that included the practice of a variety of religions. The Dutch were more tolerant of other religions than other colonial communities in other areas of the Americas, but it is important to note that the official religion of both Holland and New Netherland was the Dutch Reformed Church. Thus, while more tolerant of religious diversity, New Netherland was not completely devoid of conflict over religion. Restrictions on openly practicing other religions besides that of the Dutch Reformed Church were denied by government officials, and in some instances, those who protested the restrictions were arrested for defiance. The freedom was of religious practice in private, but not public. Officials and colonists were expected to defend the Dutch Reformed faith in New Netherland. Nonetheless, religious freedom was more extensive than in other empires. This map shows New France and New Netherland around 1650. The West India Company gradually loosened its control over New Netherland and offered incentives for settlement, including large estates for patroons, shareholders who agreed to transport tenants for agricultural labor. Several patroons established large estates where they ruled autocratically over their tenants, leading to rebellions in the 18th century as freehold tenure became common. Despite the best efforts of its rulers to attract settlers, however, New Netherland remained a tiny outpost in a global Dutch empire. The Protestant Dutch, who were interested in trade rather than conquest and had recently liberated themselves from Spanish rule over the Netherlands, generally identified with the Indians as fellow victims of Spanish and Catholic oppression. They recognized Indian sovereignty over the land and forbade Dutch settlement until legal title to the land had been purchased from the Indians. But the Dutch also required the tribes to pay them, and Dutch settlers provoked conflict with the local Indians. Borderland, according to one historian, is a meeting place of peoples where geographical and cultural borders are not clearly defined. Many of these areas developed during European settlement, such as the Great Lakes region in New France. Overlapping claims to authority and hybrid cultures developed there. Europeans generally consolidated their power at the expense of American Indian power, but at the edges of the empire, power and culture dynamics were unstable. European claims often competed against one another, and American Indians often skillfully played these groups against each other, thus increasing their own power at certain points. The types of settlements were therefore different dependent on which colonizing power established them. All colonizers brought some form of Christianity, new technology, legal and family relations, types of warfare, and disease. Dreams of freedom for Europeans and Indians alike through the spread of Christianity were continually cited as the justification for conquest and colonization. England entered the fold at the outset of the 17th century under the same pretenses. Coastal Native Americans were adept mariners. This detail from the earliest known engraving of New Amsterdam, 1627, depicts Dutch and Indian boats in the harbor. The seal of New Netherland, adopted by the Dutch West India Company in 1630, suggests the centrality of the fur trade to the colony's prospects. Surrounding the beaver is wampum, a string of beads used by Indians in religious rituals and as currency. This is a map of the New World from an illuminated manuscript produced in Le Havre, France, in 1613, depicting the French ambition to dominate North America. The precision of the coastline is unusual for maps of this era, although it reflects in large part the imagination of the cartographer.